certainly screen time is not the same as quality time across the table from each other. But largely, I'm going to talk in general, hoping and knowing that we will all be back together and mentoring face-to-face at some point. I have learned to start with this. So this is our guy, Teo. He has no inside voice. His bark is extremely loud, and he has been working about as hard as I have since the pandemic started. His dog bed is right by my feet. He's sitting there right now, and when he wakes up, there will undoubtedly be some barking. I'll try to talk through it if it doesn't go too long, and if not, I'll get him a bone and try to calm him down. But he really does apologize for the barking in advance. So I just want to start by pointing out what I think is a really critical first principle, and that is that managing and mentoring others is really a rewarding experience, but it is also simultaneously, at times, a difficult and frustrating experience. And to mentor others effectively, we really need to focus at first in two areas. And one is that we need to learn some information about how adults learn. And we need to know how we can actually promote learning as opposed to stifle learning. But the other first principle is we have to start by learning to manage ourselves. Because if we can manage ourselves, then we really can much more easily cultivate an environment and a set of relationships that promote learning. I guess I should have said, go ahead and put your questions in the chat box. I have closed the navigation tool because I find it very distracting. But if somebody feels compelled to ask a question in the middle, just unmute yourself and speak up. Or Teresa, if you see something, or Carol, you see something that needs to be addressed right away, just interrupt me. And if not, I'll take questions towards the end. So I just want to start by a little bit about managing ourselves. And the first is, I think we really need to be attuned to our own worries. And that's in general about our science, our life, and our careers. And I think especially now, this is a case where we need to acknowledge that our stress and anxiety around the coronavirus pandemic and its impact on our families and communities might be taking up some bandwidth, and it might impact the way we engage with students if we're not really careful. But I think that's true all the time. I know students who are excited to host a summer intern until they realize that, oh my gosh, I need to get ready for a committee meeting and a paper reviews are going to come back, and now I'm juggling a lot and I need to move my science forward. How am I going to do both? So I think first of all, we really need to tune into ourselves, and not only the excitement and why we're excited, because that can be an amazing motivator, but I think we also need to be attuned a little bit to our worries about what else is happening important and what else might impact this experience. I also think for those of you who are first-time mentors or relatively new mentors, often there are worries specifically about mentoring students, right? This is a learned new skill, and we usually learn by doing things that we wish we had done differently, making mistakes, reevaluating, relearning. So there's going to be some worries just about mentoring. Then we have to control our own stress level, because if we are going to take care of others, we have to first take care of ourselves. If we control our own stress level, we can balance our worries about our futures and our lives, our worries about mentoring with the actual action of mentoring. And if we don't take care of ourselves, our stress can run away and get the better of us. If we control our stress, we can promote learning, and that's really the goal. And then finally, one other thing about managing ourselves that I think is worth a short discussion and some reflection later is about setting boundaries. First of all, so we can get other important work done, right? I mean, while mentoring is very, very important, it is not the only thing of importance that's going on in any of your lives. And then we want to think about setting appropriate boundaries so we can keep things professional. And I think it's really, really important to think some about that slide. When I think about self-management, both from the realm of mentoring, but in general from the realm of relationship management, I like to think about the fact that we want to respond and not react. So a reaction is really quick, it's not well considered, it's often tense, it can be very threatening. It is driven by our reptilian brain, our survival instincts, our amygdala, our fight, flight, freeze response. Okay, a reaction can really elevate the stress of a situation. On the other hand, a response is delayed, not necessarily by a lot, but long enough for us to take a couple of deep breaths maybe to bring our energy down. A response is more thought out, calm, and non-threatening. And our goal is to respond and not react when we're faced with a challenging situation. Whether that challenging situation be that we thought our instructions were clear, but they weren't, they're out of our control. Something happens to our student and they're unable to be present at a certain time. Whatever the activating event is, we want to be able to respond calmly and not react. I actually will give you some links to some websites and webinars on stress management and wellness for scientists that I think would be really helpful in that regard. And I hope you'll visit our website, find those videos, and maybe even some of our other resources. In terms of setting boundaries, I like to encourage trainees who are becoming mentors to think about these 5 points. And one is, how will you communicate with your intern? And these slides largely come from workshops that we do to prepare our postdocs and grad students to mentor postbacks and summer interns. I do similar material with our tenure track investigators, but just to give you context of where the slides come from. And so often we have a discussion in the workshop about what people think, and some people say, I don't want to give them my home phone number, and some say I want to only use email, and others say I'm totally fine with texting each other. But you need to have given some thought to that so you can communicate it with your intern in advance. You also want to set some boundaries about when you will be available. The number of stories I hear about an intern who reaches out, really late the night before something is due, right, for assistance. And some people are available and then resent it. Some people might be available and not resent it. You have to give some thoughts about when you want to be available. And that's the same during the day. Do you want people, do you want to say I'm available all the time, just come by with questions? Or do you want to set up meeting times and then say, but here's what to do if you have a question in between. Here's the best way to come and find me or to reach me. So you need to give some thought to that. Also about the amount of help and input you'll provide on specific tasks. Clearly that boundary needs to move over time. At the beginning, we never want to say to somebody, go over, away, over there, figure it out. But eventually we might not want to give as much help. We might want to be withdrawing input to allow trainees to problem solve on their own. There needs to be boundaries about socializing, and I know right now there's probably not much socializing on campus, but virtually. Often we advise that supervisors make sure that they do their socializing in groups, largely within the boundaries of the workspace, rather than being alone with individual trainees. There's always some very heated debate about both that one and about social media. Generally, the consensus after a lot of heated debate sometimes is that sharing, friending each other on Facebook, following each other on social media can lead to lots of awkward interactions, lack of sometimes decreasing the professionalism around the relationship. But sometimes a postbac is literally just a year or two older than the summer intern they're mentoring, right? Or a postdoc might be mentoring a grad student and very, very close in age. And so sometimes people feel that this might be a boundary that they're willing to consider within certain contexts. And we won't have a chance to discuss that. My hope is that you will all meet together as a community and maybe work with some of this material. And I'm happy if you want to send some scenarios and things that we normally do. But I do think each of us needs to have thoughts about appropriate boundaries and how we're going to set those, communicate about them, reevaluate them as time moves on, etc.
Sharon, there's a question in the chat from Amy asking, does Twitter count in terms of socializing since it's more of an academic platform?
Yeah, I actually don't I mean, my Twitter account is so NIH work centric. So I think it does not count. But if you like to post political things or you like to comment on things that can be considered somewhat more controversial, then I think you should consider carefully whether you want your trainees reading that. I actually when I hire staff, I talk to them a lot about how even if it doesn't say, you know, that they work at NIH, people know them, it's reflected. What do they want on their Twitter feed? But I do think Twitter is a little bit different than Facebook or Instagram.
And Joanna asks if LinkedIn might be a better way to connect professionally.
Absolutely. I mean, it's by far the best way. We encourage at NIH, and we'll be offering a full summer curriculum, and one of the workshops we'll offer is on LinkedIn, and we will encourage each of the our virtual summer interns to connect with their PIs and mentors. I think it's a great way to connect professionally. So let's dive into some of the material. I just want to really go back to that sort of that first principle that our goal is to promote learning, right? If we're a mentor, we want our student at the end of the summer, end of the semester, end of the year to say that they learned a great deal. If we want to promote learning, we have to promote a sense of safety. No one can learn when they feel unsafe. If they feel safe, they can ask questions, ask for help, they can make mistakes and learn from them. They can tell us what they're thinking, feeling, and worrying about, so we can make adjustments or just understand where they're at. Students who feel safe take risks, right? They might step up and offer to present a lab meeting. They might say, I have an idea, can I map out an experiment and try to convince you of it? Could I present a paper? So we want to promote a safe environment so that we can promote learning. When we think about student learning, I like to talk about student learning sort of depending upon these 5 things. And the first is their natural abilities. Notice I did not use singular, I used plural, right? Students come with a variety of natural abilities in their interpersonal skills, in their laboratory skills, in their reasoning skills, problem-solving skills, communication skills, whether they have the ability, you know, sort of good hands or hands that need to develop. We all come with a mix of natural abilities, some of which come really easy to us and they tend to allow us to shine, and others that we have to work on a lot more. So they come with a mix of abilities. They also come with really different backgrounds in specific topics. And one thing I like to remind people of is that early stage learners, I mean, generally in a summer program, and I know that was the impetus for starting this, having this workshop was the summer program coming up. I mean, you're essentially mentoring an early stage learner. So by definition, they have background in some areas and gaps in other areas. The thing to remember about gaps is it may reflect just their educational timing. It may also reflect a lack of resources. Sometimes we tend to assume that gaps reflect a lack of ability, a lack of interest, a lack of commitment. We should really remember that students aren't responsible for a lacking of resources previously. While we may want them and guide them in filling a gap during the summer or during the school year, we don't want to judge them based on whatever gaps we see. Student learning also depends upon their personality, communication, and learning style. Whether they're introverted or extroverted, how well they deal with change, how focused they are on time, how easy it is for them to plan. All of these things are tied up with our personality and our work style. It also depends on how they respond to your style. So if they're a very contained, introverted, reflective student, and you're a hugely emotive, energetic, let me inspire you type of mentor, that mismatch can make it somewhat intimidating. And so it'll take some flexing to help make learning happen. Student learning also depends just on how they feel about themselves and their place at your institution and in your group. This impacts their ability to take risk. It impacts their ability to be open to your feedback. It impacts their ability to ask for help and access resources. And I think that we need to appreciate that everyone is coming into this summer really in many, many ways traumatized. This has been a collective national and communal trauma. If you're mentoring someone who just graduated from high school, they missed prom, they missed graduation, they missed the big party, right? If you are mentoring somebody who's an incoming graduate student, they missed college graduation, right? And all the big important things that go along with that. Kids had to come home from international learning experiences, just like we are disappointed in the things that we have missed out on. They too are coming into this space, maybe feeling a little bit different about themselves because of the situation. Student learning can be undermined by low self-confidence caused by a variety of reasons. It can also be undermined by the impact of imposter fears and stereotype threat, and I'll have a lot to say about imposter fears and stereotype threat in a little while. It's also undermined by vulnerabilities unrelated to the workplace that impact the workplace, whether that be an illness, whether that be a distraction due to family situation, housing and food insecurity, all types of vulnerabilities. International students now may be feeling acutely sort of less safe here in the United States, farther away from home and support systems. So people bring in whatever vulnerabilities they have, they bring them into the workplace. Student success and learning can also be impacted by how difficult it can be to receive feedback, even when it's delivered well. And the honest truth is, at least speaking for myself, feel like this is one of the hardest skills to develop. It's so hard to deliver feedback really well. The second part of this workshop is actually giving feedback so it can be heard. And I delivered it yesterday for graduate students and postdocs here. And so I've provided you with a link to a tape of that. And then finally, we are constantly delivering messages, as are the individuals in our group. And those messages can impact their sense of belonging and safety in the group, either increasing their sense of belonging and safety, in which case it's easier to take risks and learn, or decreasing their sense of belonging and safety, in which case it's much harder to take risks and learn. Usually in the workshop that we do right here, we stop and we do a fairly long journaling exercise where people journal about about a first day in a program, usually the current program that they're in, and they journal about how they felt, what was going through their head, what was helpful that people did, what was not helpful. And they journal for a good long time. I think it's an amazing exercise because after that, they talk in pairs and then they make a long list of things that they realize were important for making them feel welcome and safe. You know, first impressions make such a big difference, right? When we start off on a good foot, then we feel good about each other, and it's so much easier to continue in a positive way. And even if we hit a sort of out spot or stumbling block, we appreciate we're off to this good start, we feel good about each other, and it's going to be okay. But if somebody gets off to a not so good start, it can be very, very hard to recover. It's almost like once you dig a hole, right, you're constantly trying to fill it in and you're just throwing the dirt onto your shoes and it's not helping very much. And, you know, we've had in this workshop, people share, well, nobody told me what time to come in, so I came in at 8 and they all come in at 10 and I just sat on the floor outside a locked door. I've had people, NIH is huge, I'm sure Davis is huge. right? Where people said, I didn't even know where to go, and I didn't have a phone number. And in this case, I know you'll be meeting virtually, but maybe there are still things you want to keep in mind. So a few of these don't work at all virtually, and so you'll skip over those. One of the things that's almost nearly universal is making contact in advance. And there's a lot of discussion usually in the room that needs to be warm and welcoming, not I'll see you Monday, 9 o'clock, here are some papers, that you really want to set the stage and be welcoming. At first, you want to spend time getting to know a bit about each other. You want to show them around and make them comfortable. That might not happen this summer, but maybe you're going to have a shared drive where you're going to keep materials. Maybe you want to go through all the functions of your virtual platform to make sure that they feel really comfortable reaching out. You want to introduce them to colleagues, and even in this case where it's virtual, maybe you want them to know other people in your group. You'll be attending activities together, so that'll be important. And then you want to establish clear expectations about a whole lot of things. And each of you will have a different list in this regard. We just came up with a list of ones where there's a sort of general consensus: when they should be available for work, what your meeting schedules are, any rules and regulations, how to handle being late and that they're going to be away, any last minute scheduling changes, any required training that they need to do. Responsible conduct of research is likely to be one that might still happen this summer. You might want to talk about cultural norms in your group. Even remotely, our office has several cultural norms now. We use our Slack channel for leaving at the end of the day, something positive that happened. We post pictures of family members, dogs, pretty trees. There's some cultural norms about how we're navigating all of this. There might be Davis program obligations, and there might be other educational opportunities either at Davis or other places. For example, the NIH webinars will be open to everyone, and maybe you want to talk with your trainee about one or two of them you'd like them to attend to talk with you about. Or maybe there are ones that Davis requires that all of you go to. It's so interesting to me that it seems so obvious to the mentors that trainees will know what they're obligated to go to and what they should go to, and how often trainees tell me, I just had no idea it was that important. I think that for some it comes pretty easy, and some are willing to ask, but others are very hesitant to ask. They miss something important, and so you want to be really clear about that. You want to dive down into the research and their project and the overall context of what they'll be doing for the summer, the first of many, many times. You want to give them important readings and set clear expectations about how they will be used. Students sometimes get readings, they don't realize that the goal is to move through them completely. Then there's a discussion about it, and it's like, I didn't get all the way through it. And so that one we've learned through lots of discussion, that it can be very intimidating to read scientific papers. And so maybe not only will you give them important readings, but you'll give them resources for how to learn how to read a paper, and you'll support them through that. You'll want to cover things like research ethics, notebooks, record keeping, and all of this. If this is all done at one time in the first day, you have just like come at them with a giant hose, right? And they can't hardly get close by to collect some water in their cup. So you'll want to give them time to reflect, to ask questions, to talk some more, to follow back up. You yourself will want to come back to them to confirm understanding, address questions. And ideally, especially for early career learners, it's important to put this all in writing. But data shows that with graduate students and postdocs, having expectations in writing makes a very big difference, that it really leads to a more productive mentoring experience. So the honest truth is we all should have a welcome to my research group, a welcome to our mentoring experience together. It is generally really supported by the literature that this is a helpful thing. So that's all I have to say about expectations. We're just going to sort of move from topic to topic as we talk about setting a safe environment. And that's what I really want to do, is turn to building a sense of student safety. And I want to take that from the perspective of what do we actually do when we mentor. So we teach and help our interns learn specific concepts and skills. We model attitudes and behaviors we want to see. And I always go back to that comment about we need to take care of ourselves. If we want our trainees to stay calm and deal with setback in an appropriate way, then we have to model those attitudes and behaviors. We want to model healthy workplace relationships, a civil work environment, a respectful work environment, and they learn by watching us. So we want to keep that in mind all the time. If we are doing our jobs right, then we're giving a lot of feedback. Some feedback, appreciation feedback to elicit more of the same positive behavior, and some coaching feedback to influence change, remembering that the goal of feedback is to promote learning. Sometimes I think we give feedback when we're frustrated, and I think the goal of feedback was to vent. But really the goal of feedback is to promote learning, and so we want to give feedback when we're in a calm space and ready to give it. And one thing we really want to do as somebody stays with us over time is we want to step back and allow them to learn on their own and through their mistakes, right? We really want to give them the ability to make mistakes and learn through them. There is this great literature from Dr. Carol Dweck, who has looked at fixed mindsets and growth mindsets, and she talks about what it means to have a growth mindset, and it means that we are able to reframe and view mistakes as opportunities to learn. And so we want to help our students learn through mistakes by helping them put them in perspective and helping them see that these are opportunities for learning. And in fact, one of my favorite questions with my staff, I used to ask it of people in the lab. It endured in my transition from the lab into an office space is, so where's the learning? All right, we've already discussed the disappointments, now where's the learning? And almost always that switches a sort of pessimistic, negative conversation towards the future in a little bit more positive way. You can read her book, which is called Mindset Matters. It's available on Amazon. Quite frankly, you could just Google her name and watch her YouTube videos. Her research is based on helping students learn math, early students like 3rd and 4th graders, but there's a lot of information about how her material applies to adult learners. One of the important things as we help students learn through mistakes is we have to help them see both the process and not just the outcome. They should see both the process and the outcome. The outcome is, how did my presentation go? Or what happened in my experiment? The process might be, how did I prepare? What did I learn along the way? What new skills did I develop? How did I write up my protocol? And sometimes the outcome is disappointing, but there were real highlights in the process. And that's another way to help a student learn through mistakes, is they see that there were positive elements of the process that they should continue. And that's a launching pad for helping them see, okay, so, but where might I need to make change? And furthermore, in science, a lot of times we do a great experiment and the outcome is still sort of a bummer of a result. And it helps us teach students that by focusing on the process. And one other thing, is that we have to acknowledge the emotions that go along with making mistakes. And I'll talk a lot about acknowledging emotions when I talk about microaffirmations and affirming language. It turns out that one of the most effective ways to help students deal with emotions is to acknowledge them, give them space so that they can be processed and move on. So as we are trying to develop new skills in mentoring, I just like for people to remember a few more guiding principles, and then we'll really dive into talking about how each individual's identity can impact learning. So one thing to keep in mind is that people are motivated by a desire to belong and grow. And they do that best in an environment built on mutual respect. So we want to really build not a power over hierarchical environment, but an environment where we're working together with our mentees towards common goals. That's not to say that you are equals and that there isn't some hierarchy and that sometimes you might be the one directing the work. In fact, at times you should be directing the work, but you want to do it in a way that's respectful and positive. While we can influence behavior, we can't make anyone do something they do not want to do. And, you know, often in this workshop, people say, but how do I get them to care as much as I do? Or I've told them this 5 times and they still won't make change. And the thing is, we never can make someone change. We can try to influence behavior. We can give clear feedback. We can discuss potential consequences. We can try to motivate people to change. But in the end, if they don't want to change, it's on us to sort of figure out how to move forward, knowing that. Growth requires the courage to be imperfect and to make mistakes. And these things are very hard when you think about it from early career learners, because most of the interns we mentor are still really developing their sense of self. They are emerging adults, and all of them are emerging scientists. And so it's hard to have courage and to acknowledge what you don't know. It's really hard to feel safe and secure in a high knowledge environment where after the first 3 sentences of lab meeting, you're a little bit lost. And I think that's something that is hard. I mean, I know for me, I shut my lab about 5 or 6 years ago, but for a long time, I had a big lab full of undergraduates and full of postbacks. Sometimes it was hard for me to remember just how early they were in their learning and how intimidating it must have been to sit at lab meeting and to sit next to us at the bench and do experiments. One other thing that I think is really important to remember is that executive functioning, or our ability to multitask, our ability to really solve complex problems, our ability to stay focused in the midst of distraction and setback. Executive functioning develops late into the 20s. So for men, 27 or 28, for women, 25 or 26. So a lot of the trainees that we are mentoring have not yet fully developed their executive functioning capabilities. This is also a time when identities are being questioned and formed and reformed. This is a time when people are sorting out family relationships, who they love, you know, what they want to do in their careers. They're starting to realize, I don't have to do what my parents told me. I even don't have to do what the program director tells me. It's like a time when they are emerging into their sense of self. That means that identity has a lot of impact on student learning. And in environments that are less diverse than we wish, we are training students who are much more diverse. And I know that UC Davis has worked long and hard on increasing diversity at the faculty level, at the graduate student level, but we still, I imagine that you still look somewhat like NIH, which is incredibly diverse in our early career scientists, with diversity decreasing to some degrees as we move up along the scientific hierarchy. And so I just want to talk a little bit about identity and how identity can impact student safety and the ability of students to learn. And I just want to start that by saying we all have many identities, right? And often when I say to students, fill in the blank, I am, right? They might first yell out scientist. A lot of them do, depending on how senior they are. But eventually we get to all kinds of other identities. Some identities we're really proud of all or some of the time, and some identities we're proud of, but we sometimes struggle with all or some of the time. Students have identities, we all have identities that we're worried about disclosing or having people find out about. For some students, that can be a learning disability, that can be some mental health challenges, that can be their gender identity, their sexual orientation, that can be that their family members are blue-collar workers who have no understanding of science and are wondering what they're doing, right? It can be all kinds of things that students tell us they're worried about. And we have identities that we worry others might judge us about. And the honest truth is that we have ample examples from society that people do judge individuals around identities. And so we all carry these identities around, right? Some days we're more aware of some identities more than others. In some contexts, we're more aware of identities than others. We're just this mix of identities that we carry around with us. And when we arrive to a new space, we look around us and we sort of catalog our identities. And we become very aware of some of them, maybe less aware of others. And so it's really important to keep in mind that there are all kinds of identities our students worry about sometimes. And this is a list generated by many, many years of summer interns and postbacks doing our one-day resilience workshop at the start of an internship. There's all kinds of identities that people worry about. And I think, I mean, this is not just students, let's be honest, mentors, we worry about these identities at times as well. And I think it's just important for us to give pause and sit here and think about why does identity play such a big role in mentor-mentee relationships? You know, not to say we all have to share identities to have a successful relationship, but we at least, I think, have to be aware of the impact that identity can play and to really think about, so where are our out spots in all of this? Are there places where we might have some blind spots and discomforts, where we might have some biases that we want to think about and bring attention to so that we can reflect on them and work to understand them a little bit better? When we think about identity and we tend to look at others through our own lens, right? And we have in-groups and out-groups. An in-group is an identity group with which we identify strongly and or have substantial experience with. One of the reasons we all need to put ourselves in diverse situations is it expands our definition of our in-group, right? And that's our goal, right? I mean, ideally, we all share this identity as scientists and emerging scientists. And so we have this ability to have a very big in-group on campus. We are all in the in-group of adult learners and lifelong learners. There are also out-groups or identity groups with which we don't identify and we haven't had substantial experience with up until now. And for me, for a long time, I realized that one of my out-groups, I was raised in a very small, pretty insular religious Jewish community where I heard all kinds of messages about both non-Jews, but especially around Muslims and people from the Arab world. And I realized as I was mentoring students that sometimes I was very distracted by their identity as a Muslim, especially if a woman was wearing a hijab. I'm thinking 50% of my brain is focused on that and only 50% is engaged in this mentoring relationship. And that's an example of where an out-group really gets in the way of my ability to be a good mentor. And so I need to increase my experience, right? And learn more and stretch and extend so that mentoring across that difference can be more comfortable for me. I imagine that the student could tell I was uncomfortable. That makes them uncomfortable. That leads to not feeling safe, right? Our in-groups and out-groups are modified by cultural messages through our lifetime. And we all walk around harboring unconscious biases, and there's an equally compelling literature on unconscious favoritism, where we unconsciously favor people who look like us, sound like us, share experiences, are in our in-group. And these can be really small, subtle ways, but they can really lead to a lack of sort of perpetuating inequality because of this focus on people in our in-group. And there are two websites here. It takes a lot of time to work through material about unconscious bias and unconscious favoritism. It's really, I think, important to do that as well when we can each see each other and talk in a room. And so I'm going to refer you to these two websites that I really like, understandingprejudice.org and implicit.harvard.edu, where you can take the implicit association test that they offer and look at your unconscious biases. There's all kinds of discussions in the literature about whether those assessments truly show unconscious bias or not. I am not a social scientist, and I don't spend a lot of time debating the quality of the assessment. What I think is, where's the learning? And I almost, the honest truth is, well, I think the assessment is helpful. If I sit with this list, I can become aware of places where I have some discomfort, where I probably harbor biases. I know that I struggle right now with political affiliation a great deal, yet I mentor everybody. And so I think that whether we read about the implicit association test and decide it's valid and telling us something, or we decide not to take the assessments, maybe we don't abide by the way the assessment is done, I think we still need to sit with that list and think about things. Identity is tied closely with stereotypes and stereotype threat. And stereotype threat has a dramatic impact on student learning. And so it's really important to spend a few minutes talking about stereotypes and stereotype threat. So a stereotype is a common generalization or sort of a mental image about the typical, in air quotes, because there's no such thing as typical, but about the typical characteristics of members of a particular identity group. Sharon is a woman, so she is probably nurturing, right? Yewan is Asian, so she is probably good at math. My son is a very handsome and tall Black man, right? So Wonder is Black, and he's probably a good athlete. But then on the flip side, people often say he's probably not a very good student. So-and-so is a woman, so she's probably not very good in math. Stereotypes distort our perception and impact our judgments when we apply stereotypes to individuals. And the thing to remember is that even positive stereotypes can have negative consequences. I once read an essay, an application for graduate school from a student who said, you have no idea how hard it is to be an Asian student who doesn't love math, right? Because even positive stereotypes can have negative consequences. We can assume that somebody doesn't need help in an area. And so then we don't talk about resources. We just assume you're going to be fine. And if we don't talk about resources, then students don't hear how positive it is to use them. So I'd like you to take some time, and maybe you'll get together in small groups just to think about some of the stereotypes that might be relevant for trainees in research environments. It's interesting, we do this in the classroom, it's quiet for a very, very long time. But then eventually, as we get started talking, it's really like freeing to finally acknowledge, right? And to talk through and to put words around how you feel about stereotypes and how they can get in the way. It's important to do this because we really all need to understand stereotype threat. And I'd like to recommend the book Whistling Vivaldi, which is written by Dr. Steele, Dr. Claude Steele. It is a wonderful book on stereotype threat. There's also a video, and I'll send the slides as soon as we get off the call. So Carol or Teresa can email them out to all of you. Stereotype threat is a situation or predicament where a person is at risk or feels at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about their social group. So women typically aren't good at math, a stereotype that has persisted since I was in elementary school and probably way before that. And then there's a woman who's working in a biophysics group. There's a whole lot of men around, not so many women, maybe no women. And there's this fear of confirming the stereotype that women aren't very good in math. That fear leads a student to hide. Remember, when you don't feel safe, you can't take risks and you can't learn. One of the really important reasons for understanding stereotype threat comes from Claude Steele and I can't remember his name, Aronson. I think Daniel Aronson, but I can't remember the first name. Their research, which shows that stereotype threat contributes to the long-standing achievement gaps that we see for women in math and people of color in many science STEM environments. It doesn't account for all of the achievement gap, but it accounts for some of the achievement gap. Furthermore, simply making students aware that stereotype threat is a psychoeducational phenomenon that can impact them can help. Simply framing a discussion around learning to acknowledge the power of identity on learning can decrease the impact of stereotype threat. And the literature and the outline in Whistling, the stories that Dr. Steele tells in Whistling Vivaldi are really a great read. That, ironically, the title of Whistling Vivaldi is because he notes that as a Black man, people can be afraid as he walks down the street of his college town, but if he whistles Vivaldi, then people are safer. And I have to say, as I was putting the slides together, I couldn't help but think about the risks that Black men face when they go out for a run. And I read an article recently where someone said, I smile not because I'm happy, I'm actually really out of breath, but I smile because I don't want anyone to be afraid. And so it's a really interesting and important read. I'll pause there because I know that that's sort of difficult material. I also think it's very, very hard to hear it by somebody talking into a computer screen. I do actually have a whole gallery of pictures of my family, so I'm really lecturing to my nieces and nephews, my son, etc. But it looks like I'm just sort of talking into nowhere. So if there are any questions about that material or comments or things that you'd like to share about that, I'd be really happy to hear that now. So I've done this workshop. This is the second time now in the last 2 weeks that I noticed that both in the classroom, but also in this format, there's usually a lot of quiet when I say that. Now, usually in the classroom, I put up a prompt about, so what was hard for you in hearing that? What do you wish you heard more of? What are your responses? What do you want to tell people in your lab group about this material? And people journal about it for about 10 minutes. And then there's a really vigorous discussion where people point out unconscious biases they think they'd like to explore more, where they sort of reframe or relook at situations with particular, in their group with particular students. So I think it's a part of the material where you really have to sit a little bit and have a chance to digest it. I want to talk next about imposter fears, in part because that comes from the identity of being a new learner in an intense environment. And so it's a logical flow. I also would like to say that at NIH, we run these things called resilience discussion groups. So those are small group discussions facilitated by a counselor where students can talk about a topic that worries them. And the topic that gets the most attendance, 5 years running now, every year it is the most heavily attended sessions, are the sessions on imposter fears and cognitive distortions. So many students are impacted by imposter fears, and if we don't know about them and talk about them, we are missing out on an incredibly important element that impacts student learning. Notice that I don't use the language imposter syndrome. You will often see it in the literature in that way. I like to use fears in a hope that we can normalize them to some degree. Fear is a normal, healthy emotion that tells us we may be at risk. And imposter fears to me are a normal, healthy emotion that tells us, or signal, I should say, normal, healthy signal, telling us that we're in a very high knowledge environment and we might be at risk if we don't study, work hard. So I'm trying to use different language around them. Imposter fears are a type of cognitive distortion, and cognitive distortions are ways that our mind convinces us of things that are not true. Our mind, our brain is essentially an evolutionarily old threat sensor, right? Our archae brain was there to keep us alive. It still is. And we have on top of that layered on these higher cortical functions and ability to reason, but when we sense fear, we respond just as we used to, billions of years ago: fight, flight, freeze. None of those, fight, flight, or freeze, are helpful for learning. And so imposter fears really get in the way of learning. Imposter fears are the feeling of phoniness in people who believe that they are not intelligent, capable, or creative, despite evidence of high achievement. You got into grad school, you got in for a reason, you belong. You finished grad school, got into your postdoc, right? You belong. That doesn't mean you excel at everything, but it means you are intelligent and capable, right? To have made it that far. People with imposter fears believe that they are a phony, and that any minute, if they share, if they ask a question, if they engage in a discussion with people around them, any minute those people around them will realize they didn't belong there, that they're really a fake. They'll realize that they don't belong. Students tell me that up until the moment they drive up to the gate of NIH or get off the J bus or the red line, they are incredibly excited to be there. And then they get off, they hit the ground at the gates of NIH, and suddenly they believe they don't belong. Imposter fears can be such an incredibly strong response when you're in a new learning environment. Look at the causes of imposter fears. This is why we have to be aware of them if we are mentors. The first is simply being a student, right? So we bring in a whole bunch of students and say, come and learn something new. Just that alone will drive imposter fears. Being in an environment that feels foreign. So their first day at UC Davis, their first day, week, month at NIH, it can be moving from one lab to another as a graduate student doing rotations. It can be for a postdoc going from the research environment to teaching, right? So it's being in an environment that feels foreign is cause number 2. Cause number 3 is stereotype threat. This is why women and people of color often experience more imposter fears. And in fact, Pauline Rose Clance, who's the first scientist to describe imposter fears, started by looking at why women weren't excelling in academic environments. She extended her research from women to people of color, and over time came to realize through assessments that all people experience, or most people experience, imposter fears. But because stereotype threat can drive imposter fears, it's sort of like a 3-hit kind of thing. You're a student, you're in an environment that feels foreign, and you look different, right? And you come from a marginalized group. So those can really, really come together to cause quite difficult and debilitating imposter fears. 2 other things. One is organizational culture and messaging, right? And so sometimes I think NIH, we like to talk about how stellar we are. You know, we are the premier biomedical research institution. We have a mug, NIH, lots of really smart people. And I think about the intern in their first week trying to do their buffer calculations, right? And they might make a mistake, and there's this mug people use there, have lots of initials after their name for multiple degrees. That kind of messaging says, whoa, this is a rarefied environment and you might not fit. And then finally, some students come with baggage from family and childhood and culture at large, right? Students who brought home 90s and were told, what happened to those 10 points, or you can do better. Students who were told you're the funny one, not the smart one, right? Those kinds of things can drive imposter fears as well. So there are all kinds of things that can lead to imposter fears. And they are very, very common in our students. In fact, I'll give you this statistic, which I think is probably an underrepresentation. 70% of all people experience imposter fears at some point in their educational and work journey. I suspect there are some people who forget that they had imposter fears at some point in their educational journey, so they say no. I suspect that there are some people who prefer not to acknowledge that they had imposter fears. I suspect this number might be somewhat higher, but maybe maybe not. Only I think with more research will we know. What I can tell you is that for a couple of years in our resilience workshop, we gave people the imposter fears assessment that Dr. Clance published and put on her website. And we saw high numbers much higher than 70%. One point I want to make about imposter fears is that some people have them and they're manageable, and they can persist through them. And for some students, it can be really debilitating and get in the way. And so we really need to understand they exist, but we also need to understand that they exist on sort of a continuum from mild and not really getting in my way to so severe that I have a stomach ache, a headache, I'm clenching my jaw, I can't sleep, and I have to go into work. Based on this number, we may at some point experience imposter fears ourselves, and we likely love someone or many someones who experience imposter fears. When I teach this to PIs, a lot of times they're very excited to go home and talk about it with family members that they care about. And we also are likely to train and teach many someones who are experiencing imposter fears in the moment, right? And so we really want to keep this in mind. As we've been talking with trainees about the stress of the coronavirus pandemic, we're hearing a lot about how imposter fears are making it really hard to take risks learning online. That itself is a new learning environment. Even though we've all been on Zoom a lot, there's still a lot of things missed in that interaction. And so I think as you get to know your trainees over the summer, it might be really important to have a lot of rituals of welcoming each other, talking a little bit, finding ways to connect across this really unusual platform. So let's look at the impacts of imposter fears, and just looking at them, it becomes so obvious why they would have such a dramatic effect on student learning. They decrease confidence and increase stress. You need confidence to learn, and while some small amount of stress is good, right? We know there's something called eustress or positive stress. Distress and any kind of elevated chronic stress can really impact student learning. Imposter fears lead students to second guess themselves, and it leads students to be unwilling to ask for help. If you're worried of being found out that you don't belong, then why would you risk that by asking for help? Students hold back. So you wish they would volunteer to present the first figure at Journal Club, and they really want to. In their head, they're like, yes, I want to do this, I want to do this. But those imposter fears are just drowning out that voice. You can't do this, you're not good enough to do this, they'll find you out. It can make students very sensitive to developmental feedback or coaching or critical input. One of the reasons why we have to spend so much time practicing our feedback skills. And taken all together, and really when they become pervasive, they can lead to students engaging in self-sabotaging behaviors. I won't study, right? Because I am feeling like my confidence is so low, it doesn't feel like it will help anyway, so I won't study. Then the not studying leads to a poor grade. Aha, that's proof that I don't belong. And I think as I sat and watched my son through high school, that cycle of self-sabotaging behavior just became so sort of intensely evident to me. And as I talk to students about it, I hear again and again, yes, that's exactly it. It's not that I didn't want to study or I didn't want to read those papers. It's that I have this such pervasive fear of failing at this that I can't get started. And that leads to more and more self-sabotaging behavior. And it's really given me, in sitting and listening to students talk about this, just an appreciation of how hard it is to ask people to come into these super intense environments where we know so many details about something, right? And we ask them to contribute and get up to speed. And it makes me admire them in even greater ways. Any questions about imposter fears before we talk about how to minimize them?
I have a question, Sharon.
Yeah.
I've been with you here. I often see these types of things in trainees that I'm mentoring, whether it be imposter fears or stereotype threat, kind of creeping in. And what do you find is the best way to approach this in a sense? And you mentioned earlier that even just talking about this as a phenomenon, is helpful. Is this best to bring up kind of generally in group meetings? Is this something to tackle head on? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I actually encourage, I have a short 1-hour workshop I do about mental health and wellness for students. I actually encourage PIs to hold 1 or 2 lab meetings a year around either the science of positive psychology. You can read a paper on imposter fears that has some proactive strategies. Tackling them head on and talking about them in lab group would be great. You sharing, sometimes somebody tells us something's hard and we sort of go right back at them, oh, that happened to me. And then we run off and we start telling our story in great detail. And that's not helpful because it takes the spotlight, sort of the issue away from them. But for us to share when we're vulnerable, maybe you're getting set to go to a meeting and you're going to give a talk, and, to acknowledge, I've been doing this a long time and I'm nervous, right? I think in some ways in labs, our trainees have more experience than we do in some areas, right? So acknowledging where we're nervous about learning can go a long way. I think tackling them head on is a really important thing. The thing is, if we tackle them head on without being proactive and positive about it, then we send a message of that you're not capable. I'm going to talk a little bit about sending messages, it's sort of empowering messages. So an empowering message would be, many students have imposter fears, and we know a lot about what helps imposter fears, talking about them, right? So I encourage you to go to the student lunch, right? So that you're acknowledging them, but giving them a strategy. All right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess building off the idea about group, I was also wondering about, is it more effective sometimes to talk one-on-one with someone, or is that set up a more of an intimidating environment for those types of conversations?
I think that it depends on you, the student, and the moment. I have had, and I've learned to sit quietly a lot. And often a student will become a lot more open and sharing. We just finished a set of small group discussions. I did a Managing Up, Maximizing Mentoring Relationships webinar, and then our wellness advisors met with groups of 10 trainees at a time. We moved 300 trainees through that program last week. The biggest message the wellness advisors gave me is how much students want to share with their PIs and can't find the words. And sometimes they acknowledge their PIs are actually quite accessible, warm people. It's still really difficult. And I think if you were to sit down and say, I really am heavily vested in your success. I'm really glad you're here. I feel like we can do good work together, and I would appreciate knowing what some of the barriers might be, that some students might be hugely relieved and other students might not be. And then you'll want to end that conversation gracefully and quickly, right? Not badger them. I was really struck by how much the wellness advisors stress that PIs need to give more openings.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? So over time, through lots of different discussions and through working with this set of wellness advisors and reading the literature, we've come up with this list. There are other things, and you might have better ideas or other ideas. But when students reflect on imposter fears and what helps them, they've pointed out many of these things, that when we validate their place in the group, it helps a lot. right? So including them when seminar speakers come, saying, hey, we're gonna have a Zoom lunch. We hope you'll join us. Hopefully at some point saying, hey, come to this seminar with us. We can chat about it a little bit. Anything you do to show, I see you, I hear you, I validate you, you belong here. We want to normalize the new learner experience. I think we need to remind them we don't expect them to understand all of lab meeting. We'd like for them to hold on as long as they can and to try to ask a question, but the new learner experience is that you're going to get lost, and maybe a little less lost at the end of 10 weeks, but you're still going to get lost. That's the new learner experience around doing experiments as well. I talked already about process and not exclusively on outcome. A lot of times when a student recounts a story to me where there was a real ouch moment, but they did something that I thought really needed to be noted and celebrated, I'll pause, let them tell the story, and I'll say, before addressing those hard things, I'd like to just point out the success you had with fill in the blank. And that's a focus on process, right? And I like to, as I prepare now to give feedback to my staff in the OITE, I like to remind myself, process, process, process. We're scientists. We want to solve problems and we want to get to outcomes. Carol Dweck's work really talks a lot about helping people learn through frustration, and that helps minimize imposter fears. Anytime they can develop a skill in a low stress environment, it builds self-confidence. Self-confidence decreases imposter fears. If you feel self-confident, you can talk back to those imposter fears in the moment. We should be cautious about making people the standard bearer. We have a community college program we run at NIH, and a student came one time to a workshop and shared the story that at lab meeting in front of 20-some people, someone said, well, what do community college students think about that, right? That's like making someone the standard bearer. We want to avoid comparisons to other students and name dropping of prestigious institutions. And two things that really help with imposter fears: resilience, and being able to work through imposter fears is an element of resilience. Resilience equals people plus process. So they need to be involved in the training community. And if you have wellness events, you need to encourage them to attend some of them. For some students, extroverts want to go to everything. Introverts would like to go to fewer things. You might want to be thoughtful about the types of training, community building activities you have to appeal to both introverts and extroverts. There's now a growing literature on extroversion and introversion over Zoom, people who turn on their camera, don't turn on their camera. There's a lot here where I think we're going to be learning over time. We are all doing a big giant experiment this summer. So it'll be interesting to see as you learn throughout the summer how it goes. And then finally, a lot of students really need a safe place to talk about their imposter fears. They are rooted in experiences that happened long ago that need to be processed. And the more open and comfortable we are in referring people to talk to either program leadership or someone else about them can be really helpful. I actually, in the workshop that I do on imposter fears, talk a lot about therapy and counseling, and am really pleased to see many, many students who say, and there's a lot of stigma around counseling, but I'd really like your help in exploring that, Sharon. And I don't think that is necessarily the role of PIs, right? PIs should be open to talking about mental health issues and imposter fears and addressing things that are barriers, but often that's to refer to someone else who can get into the nuts and bolts. We want to keep good boundaries as mentors, not to become their therapists, their doctors, their parents, etc. But to encourage them to talk to the people who can step in and help is a really important idea.
Sharon, there's a few questions in the chat that I thought I would
go ahead.
Transition off this topic. Nicole asks, when I run orientations, I still usually have 20 to 30% of students who have not heard of this. After I explain it, just naming it helps a lot. Do you find the same? I
actually would say that you must run more orientations with undergrads. Nicole is my guess. I'm just guessing because I still in a room, sometimes it can be 60% of students or 70. When we talk about it with postdocs, it can be even higher. I am surprised how many people have not heard a lot. It's also possible that they heard it in a context where it didn't settle, or they heard it at a time when they weren't feeling so vulnerable, and so it didn't resonate. But I too have the same experience that lots of people don't know about them.
And then a couple more questions. Renee asks, do you have any suggestions for continuing to support a student through imposter fears apart from that first big conversation?
I actually, when a student comes to talk to me about a topic, the next time they come, hoping that I remember, and I usually do, I like to just say, so the last time we talked a lot about your imposter fears, or a lot of students will come talk to me about cognitive distortions because we teach a lot about that, and catastrophizing and all or nothing thinking really get in their way. And I'll say, how's that going? So that I keep the conversation open. I won't do it in public. If I see them at a gathering of trainees, I'm not going to bring it up, but if they do, I'll step aside and chat with them a little bit. I like to keep the conversation going. I think that if we do it one time and we don't come back to it, it's a little bit like teaching a technique one time and never coming back to it. It doesn't really stick.
And then finally, Laura asks, any tip for managing imposter fears as the mentor? The idea of, do I know enough to mentor someone else, can also be really hard.
Actually, usually some people journal about that at that beginning when we journal about what we're excited about and what we're worried about. I suggest watching the resilience workshop, and I'm going to give you the link to that, and practicing some, calm breathing in the moment to recenter yourself and collect yourself, and then learn how to kindly talk back, right? You are, I'm sure Carol will say the same thing, but what I say to our postdocs and grad students who are becoming mentors is that at the end of the summer and throughout the year, when students come talk to me, they talk a lot about how important and valuable all of you are, how much they learned from their graduate student or their postdoc. You make so many lasting positive impacts on them. So take a deep breath and remind yourself that you have a lot to offer, and you're not perfect, and neither is anyone else. So welcome to the human race, and move on. If they really are debilitating, then you have to take that same advice and find someone to talk to. And if they get in the way in the lab as well, right, and you see them in many aspects of your life, now is the time to deal with them, because they won't miraculously go away on their own. Other questions? All right. So then I'm going to transition. I want to talk in this last part.
One more
go ahead.
Question here from Colin. Do you have recommendations on how to nurture a positive environment that recognized these struggles when not in a leadership position? For example, a former graduate student transitioning into an entry-level industry position.
So all transitions, and actually I think the second week of June, we have a workshop on transitions, and all of our workshops are open to people outside NIH. All transitions come with both excitement and stress. They go together. And so any type of transition where you suddenly are in a foreign environment and suddenly asked to learn new things will trigger imposter fears. And it's the exact same strategies: learning to take a deep breath and to calmly acknowledge them. So you have to hear the imposter fears. I like to use the acronym HATS: hear them, right? Acknowledge them, appreciate that you have a choice to listen or not, talk back to them with really in kind language, right? And then seek resources if necessary, right? And really that's the strategy for all the negative head tapes in our heads. We hear them, we question them. You're all scientists, so we've all learned how to ask, what's the evidence to say I'm not going to be successful here? Well, actually, there's no evidence, right? What's the evidence to say I'm not a good mentor? In fact, if I model for my mentee saying, I don't know, let's look that up, I just taught them by my actions, right? So we hear our imposter fears, we acknowledge them, we appreciate we have the choice to listen or not, and we talk back to them. And we talk to ourselves way more than we talk to others. And so it's a really great skill to learn, to talk back to yourself in a kind way. Kristin Neff is a researcher who does research on self-compassion, which scientists tend not to like. Usually in the room, that's when everybody pulls out their phone when we talk about self-compassion. But the science of self-compassion, which is really essentially acknowledging our humanity, that we never know everything, that we're never a perfect mentor, that we have our really actually bad mentoring days. Just that compassion to acknowledge that happens and we still have value allows us to work through those negative feelings and to succeed. And so you might want to look also at the work of Kristin Neff. She has a great website. Also, she has a great TED Talk, so you can watch her TED Talk on YouTube.
We have
any other questions? Yeah.
From Eugene. You mentioned the introvert-extrovert issue. How would you help an introvert who finds it draining to socialize with lab members to feel safe and have a sense of community? If a mentor is an introvert, it may be hard to appear social and friendly. How to create a good community for the trainees?
Yeah, so communication styles is a big issue, and it's even beyond introversion and extroversion, although we could really start there. So ideally, lab meeting is structured to make it comfortable for introverts and extroverts. There's some time, maybe there's an agenda so people know what to be prepared about. If you ask for feedback, you give people some time. You can even email me later. Social events, when we organize social events, a lot of people had commented, I'll use a Zoom example, that it was just intimidating. There's 40 people, so we're 2 screens of Zoom. And now we go into breakout rooms and it's comfortable for both introverts and extroverts. Some people leave earlier, right? That's a safety for an introvert. I like to talk to trainees about the importance of being in community and encourage them to find a small group and spend some time and not focus on the large environment. But it's really, I think, important to think through activities. So we do a lot of things where there'll be a prompt, in part of it's just going to be socializing, but we'll start with a prompt and it'll be just get in a group of 3 people, right? And that's a lot less intimidating than finding some people, right? It's like everybody just get into a group, and you don't have to walk into the party and break into a conversation because we just said get into a group. And we did that after some feedback from introverted trainees that our community building events were overwhelming. So that's one idea that I have. Another one, and a lot of the ideas I have won't work during this summer because of the physical distancing. When we do workshops, we do a lot of journaling first, and that has turned out to be a boom for introverts because that's a chance to really process where you're at. I'm curious, a PI that I met at UCSF last year when I went there to teach similar material said they were going to try to use a little bit of journaling in their lab meeting. Like, maybe we're thinking about a grant resubmission, everybody write down some ideas, doodle a little bit, write about it to see if that helps some students who tended not to speak up. I don't know if they did it or if it worked, or if any of the PIs sitting here might try something like that at a lab event. But those are some of my thoughts. I don't think I gave any really great ones there, but hopefully a beginning for you to all think about. Anything else? So this is actually my favorite part of this workshop. It's material that I learned through trainers at the Parent Encouragement Program here in Maryland, when I went to talk to them about how I could adapt some of their materials for parents of teenagers for high school students. We started a high school internship program, and I was just thinking, how do I motivate a bunch of high school students? And so I went to speak with them, and they introduced me to a lot of concepts. And then as I was thinking about it, I realized it really falls under this umbrella of micro affirmations. So micro affirmations are small acts to foster inclusion, comfort, and support for people who may feel unwelcome or invisible in an academic environment or research environment. A micro affirmation is sending a signal, you belong here. I really value having you here. And the idea of micro affirmations really builds on the work of Dr. Koo from Penn State University, where they pointed out student success is actually the product of 1,000 small gestures that happen daily to convey caring and support, as opposed to sort of, killing you by 1,000 little cuts or those microaggressions that we often hear about. And so while it's really important to think about and talk about microaggressions and make sure that we are looking at our language and making sure we're not using microaggressions, it's actually, I think, in some ways more important for us to say, what micro affirmations do I use? And, how can I really help students by sending these small little aliquots of you belong, right? It's like the idea of, should I bring up imposter fears, right? In some ways, to acknowledge that it's really hard to come to UC Davis and walk into my lab and come up with an undergraduate research project. To acknowledge how hard that is a real micro affirmation, right? I acknowledge, I see that where you're at and how far you want to come, and I'm invested in that. So I really like this idea of micro affirmations. In one element of micro affirmations is developing our active listening skills. Mentoring really begins with active listening. And if we want to send messages that people belong, we have to develop our active listening skills. That means really putting our phones away, not being distracted, really concentrating fully on what's being said. It also means using questions and soft interpretations to increase our understanding. When you think about it, there's a behavior that we see, but then there's the interpretation of the behavior. And we tend to go right from behavior to interpretation. But if we ask some questions and try to get at what the behaviors are showing us, we can do a lot better. So one of the reasons why I think understanding imposter fears is so important is when students withdraw, we often see that they withdrew and we assume they're not interested. Or it could be that they're extremely interested, but they are struggling with imposter fears, and maybe on top of that, they're introverted. So this is all really difficult. And if we use questions to increase our understanding in that discussion thing, we might, rather than focusing on, you got to make change, I'm looking at you and I don't see that you care, we can be focusing on what are the barriers to you engaging. And so a big element of active listening, I think, is questions and soft interpretations. The way I see this is, right? i.e., I may not be right. When people look at active listening and try to break it down, they state these 6 things that you can look at. And sometimes we can't do all of them in a conversation, but we want to be encouraging. We want to ask questions to confirm we understand. We want to restate things to make sure we understand, we want to restate it so that we can show them, hopefully, that we understand, or they can correct us. No, that's not what I mean, right? We want to use reflection, right? Which is sort of giving some thought as to why this might be happening. We want to summarize things. We want to validate them show appreciation that they came and talked to us. And really active listening is not learned in one slide in a workshop, but it's nice to at least get it out there and to think about. So it starts with active listening. And I want to introduce the concept of remembering what it means to be encouraging. Encouraging isn't saying you can do this without rooting it in learning and in providing resources. It's really communicating that you recognize and accept and trust that trust your trainee and their ability to learn and grow, and you are providing resources to help. So for example, with effort, you can turn this first draft into an excellent poster. And I'd like to encourage you to take a look at this example, or I'd like to encourage you to go to a workshop or to get some help with some editing, right? So it's not, you'll be fine, don't worry about it. It's really here with effort, you can make this better, and here's my thoughts about what you need to do. Sometimes we actually talk to people in really discouraging ways, right? I can't believe this is what you call a first draft, right? I can't believe you think this is what a graduate student rotation should be like. And students often at this slide can easily come up with the discouraging comments they've heard. And some students realize that they can't think very much of what encouragement they've actually heard. And so for me, as I hear students talk about that, I started to look at my own language and realize that because I motivate myself by pointing out the negative, I tend to motivate others by pointing out the negative. And that's really discouraging. Another thing I want to make is empowering a student versus enabling them. So when we empower a student, we essentially turn some control, not all control, but some control over to them so they make decisions, work through material, tackle problems, find solutions on their own, versus enabling, where we take control and provide so much help and so much input and support that they don't need to learn on their own. The problem is when we enable students early in a rotation or internship, they stop trying to learn on their own. The other thing is when we enable somebody, we're essentially accepting that we're going to have to do the same thing again and again. So when we enable students in a talk by handing them all of our slides and saying, oh, don't worry, right? Then the next time they haven't developed any skill in making slides. So the next time we're still going to not be happy with the slides. And, it's sort of a perpetuating problem. So really, when we have time, and time is a big element in mentoring, and in some ways, every time I give this talk, I'm overwhelmed. I'm like, how can any of us do all of this? But when we have time, it's so much better to say something like, I made suggestions on your slides. I'd like you to work on them again and bring them back in a few days, as opposed to, here, your slides need work, so just take mine instead. Especially, and I don't know if you're going to have virtual poster session this summer. One of the biggest places where we see a lot of enabling at NIH is when people get all stressed about their trainees poster and they just hand them a poster. Here, use this, right? There's no learning in that. And the thing that the people from the parent encouragement program said to us 1,000 times is the person who does the work does the learning. And again, as scientists, we've learned to solve problems. So we want to do that really quickly. We just want to get to the outcome and skip the process. And sometimes because of time or because something is incredibly important, we might need to do a little bit of enabling and doing it together. But in general, if we want someone to learn, we have to step back and empower them to take over. 4 other things that people talk about in terms of micro affirmations and showing students that you really believe that they belong. And one is taking a strengths-based approach. And I just gave you, PIs here at NIH tell me they like me to give them a sentence that they can remember, and then they can eventually change it and use it themselves. But it's really nice to get some examples. So I give you 4 things here and a couple of examples. So a strengths-based approach would be to say, what went well today? Or what went well this week? Or what went well during your presentation? What went well during your journal club? This is something where where you're encouraging them to look at parts of things that they did well. And if they say, oh, nothing went well, it's a chance for you to help them see what did. Now, this is also sometimes just a beginning of, okay, now we talked about some things that went well. What are some things you'd like to work on for next time? So this can also be a great platform for sort of dissecting a work project. So that's an example of taking a strengths-based approach. Earlier, I talked a little bit about acknowledging the feelings that go along with mistakes. This is a really key concept to keep in mind as we're talking through problems, to acknowledge, I know this is frustrating and I'd like to discuss strategies, right? I know it's disappointing that you didn't, the paper didn't get accepted the first time. It's also typical, but it's still frustrating, right? Or disappointing. And let's sit there for a moment before we move ahead, right? Another thing is to acknowledge sometimes students make really big mistakes. My first graduate school rotation, I put in 10x too much catalyst into when I was making a gradient gel for an SDS page gel, and it exploded. The tubing exploded as I was pouring the gel, and the glass cracked because it heated up so much. You know, I was really embarrassed. Right. And I will never forget what the PI said. He said, oh, I bet you feel a little bit embarrassed. And then he said, but you really shouldn't. It's your first time and I left you alone to figure it out. And that was really kind, because I think I probably, felt really glad in the moment when I had a chance to do it myself. And he acknowledged that, oh, well, maybe you should have said, let me check everything first. So affirming feelings and helping process. The third is recognizing that they have agency. You can't be an imposter if you have agency or control over your situation. You can't not belong if you can come up with your own ideas. So what do you think happened? What led you to decide to do it this way? What might you do differently next time? Are there resources at UC Davis that you could be using? Are there resources online that you could be using? You're saying, here's somewhere where you need to grow, and how do you think you might do that? And that is, students really feel seen when you do that. And then finally, you want to reinforce positive attitudes and behaviors and the use of resources. Students who feel a lot of imposter fears and stereotype threat think often that if they don't use resources, that's a good thing, because they're conveying they got this and they can do this, right? There's some shame in using resources. And a lot of students, sometimes I lecture about shame and the science of shame, and I'm shocked at how many students say that was the most memorable part of the workshop. It can feel shameful to have to go and to the learning center, or shameful to have to go and get help with lab math, or shameful to have to go back and review basic immunology before your rotation starts. But if we model the use of resources and we use a positive attitude and language around the use of resources, that sends a totally different message. Right? That sends the message that all scientists use resources, all learners use resources. This is what we all do. So welcome to this club that you're a part of. So I'm glad you reached out to, Dr. So-and-so to work on your slides before we met. Your effort paid off. That doesn't mean you don't have some things you'd still like them to change, but you acknowledge that they made effort to get feedback, right? And to respond to that feedback. Or you stayed positive even though we hit a few bumps in the experiment, right? I really appreciate that. So those are 4 things that you can keep in mind as you're trying to be sort of convey this message of I see you, I hear you, I believe in you, you belong here, which really underlies a mentoring relationship. All of these things are just tools in your toolkit. In the last time I did this, somebody put into the chat box, this just feels like a lot, and now my imposter fears about mentoring have grown. And I agree. I'm tired at the end of the workshop. I'm like, there's so much for me to keep in mind as a boss, right? And I sometimes forget this, and I need a reminder myself. This isn't meant to be, we have to do all of this in every moment of every day. These are just things that we sort of phrases we have in our mind and ideas and concepts that we play around with. So get curious about one of them and try it on. There's a lot of different things to choose from. All of this only works if we keep in mind that our meta communication matters, right? All the nonverbal and paralanguage cues that carry meaning, that enhance what we said or negate what we say. And so our tone of voice, our body language, gestures, facial expressions, how distracted we are, whether we stand over someone or sit down next to them, whether we sit across the desk, with a computer in between us, or we move away from our desk to talk in a space where we can communicate a little bit more easily. All of those things send messages, right? And I cringe all the time when I look at this, because I realize that a lot of times just that distraction of my cell phone and the pinging of my computer is conveying a message that there are other really important things going on. And so after a while, I finally silenced all the notifications on computers in my office, and I put my phone away, and I find that I have much better mentoring relationships and much better mentoring interactions. So it was for me, putting that slide together was an especially helpful one. I talked a little bit about resilience and stress management. So since March, we've been doing doing webinars, and each of them are taped, and then they are closed captioned and moved from our platform, which is GoToWebinar, onto YouTube. So there are some helpful videos there that you might want to look at. Very, very soon, the second part of this workshop is giving feedback so it can be heard. I did it yesterday. It should be closed captioned within the next few days, but you can still watch it online if you want to. I think if you want to think about imposter fears and other cognitive distortions, and they really go hand in hand, becoming a resilient scientist is your best bet. That's a very long version of becoming a resilient scientist. We did it the second week of the quarantine, and we wanted to talk a lot about sort of the stress of developing a virtual relationship with PIs and figuring out how to telework. There are also a variety of stress management workshops. I like this one here because it has a self-care assessment. It also talks a lot about self-compassion and a little bit about using mindfulness, and being mindful about your negative self-talk goes a long way to controlling it. And then there's in the Leadership for Scientists is the most comprehensive discussion about communication styles that we have. And feedback resilience is a great one for faculty to listen to, because it's sort of get us telling students how to receive feedback, and it can often make us much more aware of the ways we give feedback. There's a great book that I like called Thanks for the Feedback that I talk about a lot in that workshop. This would be lots of hours of watching, and I'm not sure I recommend anybody watch all of them, but I just wanted to put those resources out. If you want to attend or know about what webinars we are offering and what activities we are offering, on our website is a rotating banner. It says activities for students outside of NIH. You can sign up for a listserv. Next week on Monday, we have a workshop on microaggressions and bystander actions, especially in this time of increased anti-Asian hate speech as a result of COVID-19. I felt that we should refresh our bystander training skills. So if you want to be invited to our workshops, you just need to join that listserv, or one program director can join and forward it to all of the students. But you're more than welcome to watch these. All of these will be re-offered probably this summer. We will be offering small group discussions for students outside of NIH attached to some of these workshops. So I just wanted to wrap up. I'm going to take some questions, but I just want to leave you with a few images. And this is really my favorite of everything I teach. I find that this has been the most enduring in having an impact with trainees. So this comes from the work of Marshall Rosenberg. He developed together with his colleagues a type of communication called nonviolent communication. And this is built on the work of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and sort of greats in the civil rights, in various civil rights movements. It's a way to communicate our wants and our needs and to have conflict resolved more effectively. And they say that we can communicate in two ways, like a jackal or a giraffe. So just look at the picture of the jackal, and words like aggression and power and, you know, in trouble and bad things are going to happen come to mind, right? I mean, look at those teeth, right? And that poor bird. But if you look at the giraffe, most times in the classroom, when I say what word comes to mind, people go, people take, just for some reason, this deep breath when the picture of the giraffe comes on. I mean, if you think about it, they got a pretty long neck, so they are pumping blood against quite a bit of gravity, and they have this broad vision because they see over the tree canopy. Giraffes probably fight at times, but when you look at this picture, I mean, they just seem like these caring and compassionate people. So we can talk to each other like a jackal or a giraffe, and we can talk to ourselves like a jackal or a giraffe. And dealing with things like imposter fears, that requires some giraffe language with ourselves. And when we talk to students like a jackal, right, we have sent them into a fight, flight, freeze response. None of us, I think, give really aggressive feedback or hurtful feedback or send hurtful messages intentionally. I think it happens because we are tired and stressed and overwhelmed, and as a community, we don't take care of ourselves, right? So wellness is not a word you hear often in scientific communities. So I especially encourage you to watch that stress management for scientists. There are also 2 workshops on our YouTube channel for PIs about focused on supporting trainees through the coronavirus pandemic and beyond. And those are all delivered by mental health professionals that I work with. And I think I've watched them several times. I think that they have a lot of important information. The last image I want to leave you with is this. So my wife plants milkweed in the front yard, and twice now we've had the opportunity of watching that happen, right? Going from that caterpillar on the milkweed, there's a lot of poop around. As they eat through the milkweed, they eventually become the cocoon. And then one time it happened on a Saturday, so I happened to be home and able to watch it, and this is what I got to see. And if you think about it, when you mentor, that is what happens, right? We take a student through this incredible developmental process. And I just think those are like the perfect images for ending a workshop on mentoring. And I've never actually gotten to do that with my wife here, but she just popped in. She has a mochi, so she's having a ice cream snack, which hopefully she'll share in a minute. But I just think it's an amazing image to end with. Like each PI, has the potential to do this over and over and over again. And each student who helps and each postdoc and grad student who participates, right? We play a role in this. So I don't know. It's been a hard time lately. And I think that we all need to feel some of the positive about our community. And this is what we get to do. So with that, I will take questions. I just want to end by reminding you that there will be bumps along the way. Your students will become disillusioned learners, and they will need a whole big boost of confidence and a whole lot of support. You will be a disillusioned learner at some point, but if we hold on, we all become cautious performers and high achievers. And whether a particular mentoring relationship endures and is fabulous or not, we still get a chance to make a difference. So with that, I'll take questions. We have a little bit more time. And I'm going to go ahead and open the screen now.
And there's a couple questions in the chat that I'll read. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Sharon. That was fabulous. Carly asks, as a mentee and a mentor, I put a lot of effort into making the lab a comfortable environment for students that I mentor. However, I find that I'm actively discouraged from doing this. Any recommendations on how to approach this delicately?
I guess I would need to know, actively discouraged by the PI.
Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, whoever it is could just maybe type in actively discouraged by who.
She says yes.
Yeah.
I guess the
Yeah.
PI.
So I think that it's really important to have a discussion with the PI about the value of mentoring, and hopefully the relationship is strong enough to have a discussion like that. That might take getting some coaching. It might take watching the self-advocacy workshop that I talked about, or reading one of the books like Your Perfect Right, which talks about how to have hard conversations to have your needs met. And I think talking about it and trying to explain perspective is really important. But a part of that is to decide how much, like what's the impact of being actively discouraged? If it's forbidden, that's one thing. But if you're just not getting quite the positive affirmations that you want, but you're getting a lot of value over it, sometimes I think we have to decide that feedback, like one part of feedback resilience is deciding what feedback to take or not. And I know there are PIs here, I think, at this workshop, but I'm going to say this anyway. I mean, there are stellar PIs, and those are probably the ones here, right? They volunteer and come to things, right? They might not be stellar every day, but they want to learn. But there are also PIs who are sort of absent mentors. There are PIs who are tour mentors and really don't have the best interest of students at heart. And it's important for students to decide, first of all, it's important to get a lot of support from the program, from each other, but it's also important to decide what you're going to be discouraged from. So get your active encouragement from others. Talk to other people who value mentoring. Find a mentoring mentor, right? And go and talk about what you're trying to do, because nobody should beat the love of mentoring or science out of somebody.
Great. And then Renee asks, how do you train a student on the basics in the lab while also empowering them to be independent? AKA, how much hand-holding should we be doing?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, and you know, this is really a very shortened version, and it's as if I have all the answers. Sometimes it embarrasses me that people ask these questions like I know. But in my lab, finally, after a while of going on and around about this, we decided to have all students start with something that we knew worked. So we didn't give them like a really high, high probability of success project. We gave them an experiment to start with. We gave them an almost nearly certain probability of success. We did a lot of protein interactions, so it would be a GST fusion protein and a peptide that we knew they would interact. And then we could see, did they understand controls? Could they pipette accurately? Were their labels right? A lot of times we learned that they were flipped, right? So the control showed beautiful binding, right? GST showed beautiful binding. So we would give them something to get a sense of how well they could produce and do. And then we would slowly introduce unknowns. But we found that we gave some students too much independence too soon, and we gave other students not enough independence, right? That because each student is different. And so we decided we would assess it each time. And probably all of you could come up with something that you could give a student to get a sense of where they're at. Because if you give people too much freedom at the beginning and they don't do well, then you have to undo the lack of confidence that just developed. But if you hold them back and they resent you, that's a problem, right? So asking at the end of the first week is another thing that we do. But our strategy of an experiment we knew would work, I thought really helped us do better at that. We had a huge number of undergraduates, especially when I was at UNC. It's a lot like Davis, where all the undergraduates are very keen to get into the lab. And we had much better experiences. They'd get a home run early. We'd get a chance to assess their skills early, right? High fives all around, look at that gel, right? Or let's try it again, right? But no big deal.
Those are great tips. Dan also asks, how do we change the community, specifically promotions and tenure in academia? to better reward and evaluate PIs for their skills in mentoring. How can NIH help academia with this? I'm thinking something like appreciating broader impacts like the NSF does.
Yeah, you know, so first of all, let me say I work in the Intramural program. So I work a lot on NIH educational policy, but not so much around grants. And I have the same frustration at NIH. Our tenure system, they claim that they value mentoring and they're making moves towards that, but it's a lot of times I think really that person got tenure, right? I think that while NIH has some role and writing a broader impact statement might help, the bigger role is the promotion and tenure committees at the university. And I don't mean to sort of dump the responsibility. I think NIH, you know, I'm on the anti-harassment steering committee at NIH, and I've been advocating for a long time that if trainees were given the money, that harassers wouldn't hold on to trainees and we wouldn't perpetuate poor mentoring or harassment or toxic work environments. And all three of these are really detrimental to mental health and wellness and everything. I mean, I do think NIH could they could expand their F program and, you know, at the expense of some other funding initiatives, or if we got a budget increase, just increase it. The problem is Fs come when students have joined a lab, and they really need to come earlier on when students could use that money to vote with their feet. But I do think that's one thing NIH could do, is expand the pool of money directly to students. Also, training grants give students more freedom and flexibility. So that would improve mentoring, right? If you can't get a student on this training grant unless you took a mentoring course, right? And that would help, and NIH could help the university in requiring that. But the policy is, you know, for some people don't, I mean, if you don't care about mentoring, no amount of policy is going to change it. So then we have to help people not land in those environments. That's a really negative question to end on. So let's try something more positive.
Yeah, and people are free to unmute themselves if they want to ask too, or put in a chat either way.
You're also free to turn on your camera. Hey, Ben, Laura. All right, some people did.
Virtually. Yeah.
So interesting. We learn so much about people from what's behind them.
Yeah.
Anybody have anything else? Hey, Chris, do I know you? I do, I think. Anybody else have a question?
I think my mentee just presented at the undergraduate symposium for NIH.
Oh, really? Very cool. Very, very cool. Anybody else? All right, it's 6 o'clock here. And so we have this habit in our house at a wellness workshop. Somebody said, you should commute home. You should commute to work and home every day, even though you're working from home. So I actually will take the dog and commute home in a few minutes. It was really, really nice. This is nothing like being together in person. And I'm really sorry. I feel like this kind of workshop shouldn't be delivered this way. It should be in a room and people should be talking and chatting. And so I apologize for that, but I'm still glad that I got to join you. And I hope you're all safe and that your families and you stay safe. And thank you all.
We're so grateful for your coming. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Everybody take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you again, Sharon.
Yeah, thank you. That was really, really great. That was super helpful.